it's time for that portion of the program we refer to, for lack of a better name, as Breaking the News, where executive producer Brad Herring and I go through some of the news stories of the week and talk about them. That's basically it. So, Brad, what do we have?
Some might say we break them.
Indeed, hence the name. So what do we got?
So the biggest news of the week happened out of Missouri, the University of Missouri specifically. After a wave of racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism on its campus, students at the University of Missouri this week managed to force out the university's president and chancellor, who were seen as turning a blind eye to students' concerns. It was something of a kind of perfect storm there, a long history of racism at the university, and not just that university, as we'll get into. It met a civil rights movement that had been newly emboldened by national events, and a walkout by several players on the football team. Jonathan Butler, a graduate student at the university, had been on a hunger strike since November 2nd to force President Tim Wolf's ouster. Many of the students who took part in this uprising had spent time on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, site of Michael Brown's death by police bullets in 2014. And Ferguson is only a 2-hour drive from the University of Missouri.
So this story raises so many interesting and important issues, I think. First of all, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about it in the media and online and so on. And there's so many resonances to it. I mean, one of the interesting things about it to me is that the hunger strike by Jonathan Butler really, people were saying, well, that really didn't accomplish anything, but it did. Here's what it accomplished. It got the football players interested, as I understand it. And when the football players threatened to go on strike, that had profound financial implications for the school. So the chancellor, who, as I understand it, was the president and chancellor, was a big football booster. In fact, used to just bug these students about, get out and cheer for your team. In the end, it was his fatal flaw, and it was what undid him. But of course, his true fatal flaw, according to reports that I've seen, was his inaction in the face of years of ongoing racism, right?
Yeah. There were specific events. There were people that were yelled at by passing trucks on the street, just kinds of really old school racism that you'd think this country would be past. And there was the one story about, which a lot of conservative media tried to downplay and say it didn't actually happen, which was smearing of a swastika in feces on a wall, which they actually ended up coming out with pictures that, hey, yeah, it did happen. This is actually true. I'm interested in particular on the football team and the football aspect of that, because that's where colleges like University of Missouri make their money and lose their money. In this case, they would have. Had they canceled the next game after these students walked out, that was $1 million that they would lose right there, that they would forfeit. Tim Wolf didn't make $1 million in a year. You get rid of him, easy enough.
Right.
That's the problem solved.
Well, and we've covered on this show in the past, we've covered the economics of college sports and the exploitation of college athletes, the fact that these kids ought to be paid, they ought to have contracts, they're working people. So, I think that's a big dimension of it. I think also, it's interesting because I think we've reached the point in this conversation where we should be, we meaning in this case, I should be specific, the students who are engaging in these actions, really, I think the country needs to have it spelled out what would appropriate proactive administration and leadership look like in a case like this? What should the president of the university have done that he didn't do in a case like this? I mean, some of the things are obvious, I would think. If there's the swastika incident, he should be investigating. He should be making it clear this is not part of the culture of the school. But have you read anything, or have you had any thoughts on what else should have been done?
I haven't looked too deeply into what he did do or what he didn't do. From what I understand, he didn't do anything. There was no investigation. There were numerous students coming to him en masse saying, we have major problems on this campus. And I think it was the lack of being taken seriously at all was what drove this. It was perfunctory investigations that didn't actually achieve anything at all.
Now, there were also demonstrations at Yale University this week. There were demonstrations at Ithaca College in upstate New York. They're demanding the resignation of the president there over accusations he's failed to address racism issues.
Yeah.
And there was the resignation of the dean of Claremont McKenna College in California. And in that case, as I understand it, she herself was the trigger for the incident. She sparked a campus protest, and there were hunger strikes by two students because she had written to a Latina student saying that she, the president, would work to serve students like this young Latina woman who, quote unquote, don't fit our CMC mold. And,
Wow.
you know, that's pretty much saying, really? So there's a mold and it's white, European descent. Wow. Okay. So English speaking, X number of how many generations back do you have to be English speaking, and so on.
Seriously.
So she really walked into it.
There's one other aspect specifically to the University of Missouri story that I want to get into.
Oh yeah, I don't want to leave I'm just pointing out that there's a broad movement taking
of course.
place here.
And that brings up other issues. A lot of people in the conservative media have been claiming that this is just these sort of microaggressions and that it's not anything seriously, not that they're just being blown out of proportion. It's that whole PC mess. But one thing I want to get into real quick is this idea of it's a walkout by the football players. That was the problem, that they just walked off the pitch and decided not to play. I think we need to call it what it is, which is a strike. They are university employees for all intents and purposes. They generate enormous amounts of revenue for the school, but they don't get paid like it. This is the one opportunity that they have, the one mechanism to impact the university, which is their labor, take it away. And that's what it's one of the most successful strikes we've seen in ages.
In a sense, if there was any question about whether they were employees, that was answered by the university, or whether they were workers, to use that term, that was answered by the University of Missouri this week, because if they weren't workers, the withdrawal of their services would not have led to an immediate result. So clearly, I mean, we've had that confirmation. Another interesting thing about Missouri in particular was, tell us a little bit about this incident with the reporter and the journalism professor.
Yeah, so a lot of the activists, and this is not atypical of other protests, being very distrustful of members of the media. We saw that a lot in Ferguson, people who didn't think that media figures took their story seriously until there was tear gas in the street and blood on the ground, basically, which is a valid criticism. A lot of times media figures will distort protesters' views and kind of sensationalize the issue, but the tension in Missouri came to a head during one of these protests. I believe it was immediately after Tim Wolf announced his resignation, when University of Missouri assistant professor Melissa Click was caught on camera calling for, quote, muscle to forcibly remove a journalist covering the protest. It was this weird kind of gang mentality moment. She later apologized correctly, but that event and the broader protest around it exposed some freedom of speech issues on college campuses.
Yeah, I absolutely, and that opens up another huge area. I mean, the first area it opens up is, to what extent in the past when people have staged public protests, they are in effect saying that their action in the space they're occupying is public space. It's the seizure of private of space for public purposes, whether it's Occupy or going back to the Civil Rights Movement or going back before that. So in a sense, these students were saying, we are doing that, we are making a public statement in a public space and declaring a public space, but we're declaring this part of it private.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I'm still wrestling with, because and the hostility towards journalism. Look, I mean, we're alternative media here. I have, we've gone on and on in this show about the problems with mainstream media, why they can't be trusted, corporate media, and so on. But on the other hand, there are some fundamental principles of freedom of speech, freedom to report, freedom of journalism, and calling for muscle, particularly, was, that was not a good moment.
It's borderline fascist.
Yeah, to me. And, this professor, Melissa Click, I think she was in two departments. One was she had some sort of lectureship. I can't remember the exact title in the journalism school, and she's voluntarily withdrawn that. But I think she's still at the University of Missouri. And there's this other issue too when we get onto free speech on campus, and we won't have time to explore. Maybe we want to do a segment on it, but there was a whole issue of the Yale professor who told the students. First, the school put out an announcement saying, that Halloween costumes should not be offensive to minorities and other groups, and then she and her husband, who I guess were dorm masters, they call them, were saying, don't stress about it. Being young is a time to be outrageous, and if you want to wear something outrageous, wear something outrageous. I'm oversimplifying, but and if you're offended by it, tell the person that's offended you why they've offended them. But she really, that's an incredibly complex issue. I think with a lot of arguments to be explored on both sides of it. But what do you think? Hey, did you follow that at all? What do you think about that?
I think it gets to this idea that the best counter for speech you don't like is all speech, basically. That no speech should be taken out, and every kind of speech should be evaluated on its merits. And it's this weird utopian idea. It's almost kind of a false free market idea that the kind of speech that's best is the speech that's going to rise to the top. And we're not seeing that in the Republican debate, first of all. Those little tease of where we're going next. But this idea that we need to protect what people are saying, even if we agree with it, even if we don't agree with it, it's a valid part of the communication. And that brings up, does that also include violent speech? Does it also include what this idiot in Missouri posted on Yik Yak, that he's going to shoot every black person that he sees? Where do we draw that line?
To be fair to this professor, I don't think she's saying that, but I think it gets to a certain extent to the difference between a university.
But they're both meant to provoke. That's what I'm getting at. Dressing up in blackface is meant to provoke. There's no. I don't think there's anyone who's doing that.
I hear you, but I don't want to mischaracterize
Yeah.
what I think her position was, but
I'm definitely taking it to the extreme.
Yeah,
It's
but
yeah.
I would say it also gets to the issue of, a university is a teaching institution.
Sure.
A university has a culture of its own, and that culture should reflect the best of us. So an abstract notion of free speech that says, well, you can pretty much dress however you want. I mean, we're not talking about an abstract situation. We're talking about a concrete situation, and we're talking about a concrete history of racism and of bias against gender differences, sexual preference differences, gender identity differences, so on. So, it's fine to say in the abstract, but you're building a community in a university, and if you build a community that is consciously tolerant of the abuse of historically abused and marginalized subgroups, you run into other problems. So I think, in a sense, she was guilty perhaps of oversimplifying and naivete. But, there's...
And how naive is it to say that if you're the one black person at a party and there are 5 people in blackface, that you're going to go up to them and say, no, you're offending me. That's just not how the world works.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that assumes a kind of equality of access and of speech and the idea that if you're going to go up to 20 drunken, let's say, frat boys in blackface, if you're an African American young woman or two African or whatever it may be, it's just not realistic.
Yeah.
I want to switch to another story related to this, which is the student protest on Thursday. Student protesters nationwide. I'm reading in this case from Time magazine. Demand free tuition, $15 minimum wage, and an end to student debt. They say they were inspired. It was originally called the Million Student March. They say they were originally inspired by a comment Bernie Sanders, my boss, which I always mention, my boss in my non-radio life, made earlier this year. He said it would take 1 million students marching to make elected officials care about higher education. So they said, well, they took that as a challenge. Now, they in addition to supporting those things, they want free tuition at public universities and the abolition of student debt, which I should say is an aside that I think I and the Campaign for America's Future and the folks we've had on the show before, the Jubilee program to end student debt, were perhaps the first to call for the idea that this $1.3 trillion maybe should be alleviated, so or abolished altogether. So it was driven by a coalition of left groups, and it got some attention, which was a significant, I think, breakthrough on their part. Did you follow that? What did you think of that story?
I didn't follow it very closely. I was aware of it, as I know a lot of people working in that movement. I have a question for you, though, and I was wondering if you know the mechanism of this. How would that apply?
How would that be done if you were to...
How would it be done to just forgive $1+ trillion in debt? Would that be something where the government pays it back?
Well, 86% of it is underwritten by the U.S. government anyway.
Oh, okay.
So there's that, and then there's, and by the way, while Bernie Sanders may have inspired this demonstration, that's not his position, but that's where they went with that.
It's his idea, I guess.
Well, his idea was the million students,
sure.
you know, but 86% of it is owned by the federal government. And then I guess the idea would be to step in and alleviate, the other 14%. It's an interesting question. It gets into all sorts of nuances about, well, what about graduate schools? What about medical schools?
Sure.
What about
but what about pre-K?
Well, pre-K should be free.
Absolutely.
I mean, there aren't people, carrying $100,000 worth of debt for pre-K, but and it should be accessible to everyone. But the idea is, if we really believe that education should be accessible and free to all, and that basically a college education today is what a high school education was when high school, then there's a kind of hinge generation of people who didn't get it, because it used to be virtually free to get a public education in this country. But so the idea is, well, what do you do with the people in the middle? If we establish free higher education going forward, what do you do with these folks? Yeah. So it's just something to think about, and it shows that we might be entering an interesting time when campuses on this country, college campuses, again become seed beds for change the way they were in the 60s. So.
Yeah. I'm going to get to one more story before we get out of here. We talked a lot about college. Let's talk about kind of some good news. I think we got today, just kind of breaking. We're recording this on Friday. So did you hear about this story? Conservatives, first of all, they want to talk about judicial activism whenever they want to claim that they're being persecuted. But we found an actual activist judge. Get a load of Judge Scott Johansson, a juvenile court judge in Utah's 7th District, who took an adopted child away from its parents because the parents were gay. Literally no other explanation, just simply because of his desire to force his religious beliefs on others. He claimed that he did research and found that children in heterosexual homes did better in life, which is based on nothing real, no actual evidence. So next time anyone tells you that their rights are being infringed because their wedding cake business has to make a wedding cake, here's yet another example of actual religious persecution. And I say it's a good news because just today the judge reversed his order. It wasn't a complete success because he said he eliminated a line in his ruling saying that, quote, "It is not in the best interest of children to be raised by same-sex couples," and another ordering the child removed and placed with a heterosexual couple. But the new order still says the court cited a concern that research has shown that children are more emotionally and mentally stable when raised by a mother and father in the same home. So pretty ugly there still, but fortunately the child is staying with his parents for now.
Yeah, and we've got to. We could do a whole segment on the real judicial activism among conservative judges, but at least this one, well, it must have been a horrible experience to go through for the family. At least it ended happily for now.
Indeed, and that is all we've got for today. We're going to get to that debate. We're going to get to that a bit later in the show because that was a huge one, and we've also got Donald Trump kind of melting down. I think we're going to talk about a bit later.
Oh,
in
yeah,
the
that
show.
deserves a segment of its own. All right, very good. So we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.